The year was 106 CE. The empire was at its peak under Emperor Trajan. Walls extended from Britannia to Mesopotamia, grain flowed from Egypt, and roads stretched like veins across 3 continents. But beneath the marble statues and triumphal arches, in the shadow of the Colosseum's vast tiers, men prepared for slaughter. They weren't soldiers. They were gladiators. You weren't always a slave. Some came from noble blood, Thracian warriors taken in battle, Gallic chiefs brought in chains, even disgraced Roman officers who defied the wrong senator. Others were criminals sentenced under damnatio ad ludum, the punishment of the games. There were debtors too, crushed by unpaid loans, and men who signed contracts to fight, lured by the dream of gold and glory. But no matter your past, once you passed through the iron gate of the ludus, it was gone. Your name? Replaced with a number or a crude nickname, Scorpus, Crixus, Maximus. A joke, a brand, not a memory. Your voice didn't matter. Orders came from the lanista. He owned you. The process was systematic. Stripped naked, hair shaved, skin inspected like livestock. A tattoo marked your status on the arm, chest, or face. You were weighed, measured, and judged for fighting class. Strength meant murmillo. Speed meant thraex. Slim, wiry men often became retiarius, destined to face heavily armored brutes with nothing but a net and trident. No one asked what you wanted. You were cast, not consulted. Your possessions were taken. Even names of your family were forbidden in the ludus. Some schools had hundreds of men, eating, sleeping, and bleeding together, all stripped of history. You trained with strangers, lived beside enemies, and learned to forget. Outside, the Roman people spoke your name only when betting on your death. This was not a place of heroes. It was a factory of death. The walls echoed with groans, metal clashing, and men screaming in sleep from nightmares of lions and blades. A few slaves worked as medics, applying vinegar to wounds or splinting broken bones. But there was no healing here, only maintenance. You were kept alive only as long as you could perform. A boy from Hispania once arrived at the ludus in Capua, barely 17, still with farm dirt under his nails. Within a month, his nose was broken, 2 ribs cracked, and he no longer cried at night. He didn't remember the sound of birds. He remembered the hiss of sand raked smooth every morning, ready for blood. By your 3rd week, you stopped asking questions. You learned the rhythm of the place. Bread at dawn, oil rubs, morning drills, combat in the heat. No privacy, no choices. You slept on straw beside men who might gut you in a month. You learned silence. In the evening, you might hear the faint cheers from the Colosseum, just beyond the city's skyline, where other men fought while you waited. You'd lie still, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many had died that day, wondering if next week your number would be called. Because here's what no one tells you. When you became a gladiator, you didn't just lose your freedom. You lost the past. Rome made sure of it. You weren't a soldier. You weren't a criminal. You weren't a man. You were a tool, a blade forged not for battle but for theater. And your story only mattered if it ended in spectacle. The days blurred, not from boredom but from routine so brutal it erased thought. The ludus was designed to break you down, not with cruelty, but with discipline engineered for a single purpose: survival in the sand. But not your survival, Rome's. The Colosseum was a theater of violence, and you were its actor, its prop, its expendable soul. Every morning began before dawn. No talking, just the clatter of sandals on stone as men shuffled to the training yard. The sun wasn't even up when the lanista's voice echoed across the walls. You started with body drills, carrying logs, dragging weighted sleds across gravel, running in armor that crushed the shoulders and burned the thighs. Then came weapons practice. Wooden swords at first, heavy as iron, meant to build muscle. Shields too solid oak, thicker than anything used in real battle. These weren't tools for protection. They were weights, and you were the mule. You learned footwork, rhythm, breathing, how to fall backward without snapping your neck, how to roll under a spear, how to shield your thigh, the most targeted spot on any fighter. Your reflexes were trained not by thought but by repetition. Blocks timed to horn signals, counterstrikes shouted in Latin. The lanista and his doctors watched everything, sticks in hand. Mistakes weren't corrected with words. They were punished with bruises. You learned fast. By the second month, you were assigned a role. Not a personal one, a category. Murmillo if you were tall and broad. Secutor if you were aggressive. Hoplomachus for agility. If you were lean and fast, they gave you a net and trident and sent you to train as a retiarius. You were laughed at by the others. No shield. No helmet. Just skill and speed and a short dagger for when the net failed. The retiarii had the highest death rate. But there was no protest. You didn't question the system. Rome didn't just own your body. It shaped your mind. The lanista knew how to bend men without breaking them. He fed you stories of past champions, tales of freedmen who earned fortune and fame, all to keep you swinging your sword harder. Most of them were lies. Weapons were upgraded slowly. First dull metal to test grip and control. Then sharpened steel weighted to match your assigned gear. You were never allowed to keep them unsupervised. Some tried to escape. Almost none succeeded. The ludus had informants among the slaves, and desertion meant public crucifixion. Slow, humiliating, mandatory viewing for the rest of the school. Meals were calculated. Barley porridge, beans, dried figs, goat meat. High energy, low cost. You weren't nourished, you were fueled like a chariot before a race. Wine was rare. Water was rationed. Even rest was strategic. Just enough to keep muscles from breaking, never enough to soften resolve. Injuries were constant. Dislocated shoulders. Torn muscles. Cracked jaws. If you could walk, you trained. If you couldn't, you healed until you could. No one retired from the ludus. You either advanced to the arena, or you were discarded as useless. Some begged for death. It wasn't granted. There were days when the city's noise would break through the walls. Chariots clattering on stone. Priests chanting. Senators giving speeches in the forum. But it felt distant, unreal. The ludus was a world apart. Rome's rich watched your kind from cushioned seats, sipping wine and wagering coins. They came for blood, not biography. Sometimes veterans visited men who had fought and somehow survived 10, 20 matches. Their bodies were mangled maps of violence. Missing fingers, gouged eyes, half ears. But they stood tall. They told stories. Not to comfort you, but to remind you that pain didn't matter. Only performance did. In the rare evenings without drills, you were allowed into the baths. Hot water, steam, and silence. No one laughed. No one spoke much. You could see the scars on every man there. The long, jagged ones told of narrow escapes. The short, deep ones told of close kills. You read them like scripture. And you never forgot this. Training was not to make you strong. It was to make you predictable. Rome didn't want wild fighters. It wanted spectacle. Every movement you practiced was meant to fit a pattern the audience recognized. Shield blocks, feints, final thrusts. You weren't taught to win. You were taught to perform death in slow, violent theater. Because when your name was called and the day came, when the Colosseum gates opened, you weren't judged by how well you fought. You were judged by how much they cheered. By the time you stood before the armor racks, the day had already been decided for you. You didn't choose your armor. You didn't choose your opponent. You didn't choose your weapon. The empire did. The ludus served not only as a training ground, but as a factory of roles, and you were assigned one based on body type, not preference. If you were stocky and powerful, you were likely a murmillo. Given a gladius, a large rectangular scutum, and a helmet with a high crest and small vision slits. You moved slow, struck hard, absorbed damage. You looked impressive from the stands. The murmillo often faced a thraex or hoplomachus, fighters with smaller shields, curved swords, and armor that forced quick, acrobatic movements. That's how they designed it. Contrast, speed versus strength, crowd-pleasing. If you were lean, agile, but unlucky, you became a retiarius. You wore almost no armor. A metal guard on your left arm, some padding on your shoulder, and nothing else. Your weapons. A net, a trident, and a pugio dagger. No helmet, no shield. The crowd either loved or mocked the retiarius. Some thought you were effeminate, a joke, thrown in the arena to be slaughtered. Others admired your courage. You were expected to dance around the opponent, dodge blows, trap them with your net. But if the net failed and your trident missed, you were left with nothing but a knife and a prayer. You were taught how to move, how to gesture, how to fight like your role demanded. It wasn't enough to survive. You had to embody the character Rome assigned you. A murmillo had to move like a juggernaut, slow and brutal. A secutor had to pursue relentlessly, helmet-shaped to chase the retiarius without getting tangled. A thraex had to leap, strike, retreat. It was combat, but it was also theater. You weren't in control of who you fought. That was decided by the editor, the man who organized the games, often a magistrate or senator. He picked matchups like a playwright casting roles. He sought balance, but also drama. Two murmillos never fought each other. The audience wouldn't understand it. They wanted storylines. The veteran versus the new recruit. The agile versus the armored. The cruel versus the noble. The gear was punishing. Helmets were stifling, with narrow slits for eyes, cutting off peripheral vision. Some were so heavy that you couldn't hear clearly once the crowd began shouting. Inside, your breath echoed loud in your ears, every gasp sounding like thunder. The moment sweat began to pour, the helmet became a trap. Heat, salt, blindness. Shields weren't tailored. They were issued by size. If yours didn't fit properly, tough luck. Straps rubbed skin raw. If your forearm was too thin, you had to wrap it until it held. If it was too thick, you'd fight with less control. Gloves weren't standard. Some tied cloth around their hands. Others bled from the first hour onward. There were no backups. If your sword broke in the middle of combat, you kept fighting. If your net tore or your trident snapped, it was your failure. Rome didn't choreograph matches, but it did expect certain outcomes. Quick kills were frowned upon. The crowd paid for drama. You were told in the ludus, wound first, kill last. Make it look good. And the worst part, your opponent was a mirror. He trained where you trained, ate where you ate, slept 2 cells down. You might have shared a joke days ago. You might have helped him bandage a cut. But when the editor called your names, none of that mattered. One of you would fall. Maybe both. There were match types too. Sometimes it was one-on-one. Other times it was team fights with pairs or trios set against each other. The crowd loved chaos. Special games included beast fights, venations, where you might be armed with only a spear or sword and told to face a bear, lion, or even a rhino. You were a gladiator, but that didn't always mean you fought men. Some fought blindfolded. Others were chained at the ankle. If the editor wanted novelty, he got it. If the emperor wanted a theme, like Carthaginian pirates or Persian rebels, you might be dressed up, paraded, and sent out to die as living props. And sometimes you didn't even get to fight. You were put on display in mock battles that ended in slaughter, no weapons for you, just costumes and curses. The crowd laughed, tossed coins, cheered your death. You weren't a man in those moments. You were a statement. Your weapon wasn't for winning. It was for putting on a show. The shape of your sword, the curve of your shield, the feathers on your helmet. All of it was part of the illusion that Rome wanted to see. You were a living extension of empire, brutality dressed in bronze, made to bleed beautifully. And once you stepped into the arena, none of it could be changed. Your fate had already been written by men in silk robes and golden rings, sitting high above, sipping wine while they judged how loudly you made the mob roar. The day came. You woke to silence. No drills, no barking orders. Just the soft scrape of sandals on stone as men were roused one by one, faces pale in the torchlight. You didn't eat much. Bread, maybe. Water. Your stomach was coiled too tight for anything heavier. Today you would fight. The route to the Colosseum was short, but it stretched long in your mind. You moved in a line through underground corridors that reeked of oil, rust, and fear. The Flavian amphitheater stood above you. Towers of arches, marble columns, a monument to Roman power and pride. 50,000 seats. It was said you could hear the crowd before you even saw the sky. And they were already screaming. The tunnels below the arena were chaos. Slaves rushed past with torches. Wagons brought in animals. Tigers, leopards, bulls, each one snarling or sedated. You passed cages stacked 3 high, reeking of blood and dung. You passed other fighters, some silent in prayer, others pacing like caged wolves. Some vomited, then straightened their armor. One man wept openly. No one mocked him. The air was thick with heat. Fires kept the underground warm, so the sudden exposure to the open arena wouldn't freeze muscles. That warmth turned the blood stench into something suffocating. You couldn't avoid it. You breathed it in. The smell of old death. Dried blood in the sand. Iron from weapons. Smoke from morning executions still hanging in the air. You could hear the beasts too. Lions growling deep in their throats. Boars squealing in fury. Their fights came first before yours. Romans liked to build their day of entertainment from suffering upward. The Venetians' animal hunts were the opening act. Gladiators rarely fought in these unless they were being punished. But condemned criminals, no-name slaves, were shoved in first. They had no armor, no chance. Some were naked. Some were dressed in animal skins for the joke of it. They died screaming while the crowd ate breakfast. Then came the executions. Some were theatrical reenactments of myths. A man tied to a post playing Prometheus as a vulture tore at his belly. Another nailed to a cross, arms dislocated, left to twitch while the midday sun climbed. A woman set aflame for witchcraft, her screams drowned by the chant of the crowd. Executions were not the sideshow. They were the spine of the morning. Rome reminded itself every day who ruled, and who could be broken. You waited, not just minutes, hours. The roar of the crowd rose and fell. You sat in a chamber, armor on, weapons across your knees, and waited for your name to be called. Sweat pooled in your palms. You counted heartbeats. You stared at the ground. Then it was time. The preco, the announcer, called names into the arena. Trumpets sounded. The portcullis opened with a groan of iron and chains. You stepped forward into blinding sunlight. The sand was hot underfoot. The crowd, a mass of tunics, togas, and faces, roared like an ocean storm. Your opponent was already waiting, or stepped out beside you. You didn't look at him. Not yet. You stared at the emperor's box. That's where your life would be decided. Not in combat, but by a gesture, a thumb. You raised your weapon, saluted the emperor, the editor, the gods. Ugula! Someone shouted. Throat him! You didn't hear the crowd as individuals. Just sound. Noise so loud it beat like a second heart in your skull. The sand under your boots wasn't just dusty. It was coarse, stained, mixed with flakes of old bone. You could smell it even above your own sweat. Then the fight began. No one shouted, "Go." No one blew a whistle. It started with a twitch, a step forward, a feint. You circled each other, felt for weight, distance, timing. You listened for the rhythm of his breath. You watched his shoulders, not his eyes. First blood drew a roar. Not a kill. Just a slice across the thigh, a cut to the forearm, something visible from the stands. The crowd wanted pain they could see. They wanted wounds that looked fatal even if they weren't. Some matches ended quickly. A lucky strike, a failed block, a stumble. But those were booed. The best fights, the ones that earned applause, dragged on. You were taught to prolong, to bleed without panicking, to fake injury, to drop to a knee and rise again. Shield raised, sword gritted in teeth. If you fought well, they watched. If you fought brilliantly, they chanted your name. The crowd swayed your fate. The editor listened to them. The emperor watched them. Mercy was not guaranteed by skill. It was bought with performance. If they liked you, they screamed, "Mit! Send him away!" A call for mercy. If they wanted blood, they shouted, "Ugula!" again and again, until the decision was clear. Pollice verso, the turning of the thumb. That was the moment. Not always the thumb down, as movies pretend. Sometimes the thumb was turned to the side. Sometimes up. The meaning shifted with time, with culture. But all you watched for was the editor's signal. He would look to the crowd, then point. And then, if you were the one standing, you either gave the final blow or knelt and waited for yours. It wasn't always a clean death. Some men begged. Others shouted curses to the last. Some stood silent, chest bared, and waited for the sword. The Colosseum didn't smell like glory. It smelled like death, baked into the sand, soaked into the wood of the seats, rising with every scream into the marble arches of Rome's grandest theater. The moment after the kill was worse than the kill itself. Whether you were the victor or the one spared, the next seconds were filled with silence that screamed louder than the crowd ever could. Blood soaked into the sand around you. It mixed with the dust, forming dark patches under your feet. You didn't move at first. You couldn't. Your heart slammed in your chest like a trapped bird. Your limbs were locked between collapse and combat, and the echoes of iron on bones still rang in your ears. If you killed, you stood over the body. The editor gave a final nod. Slaves came running, not to mourn, but to clean. They dragged corpses by the limbs, sometimes with hooks, leaving red trails behind. Other slaves swept sand over the blood. Fresh gravel was poured from buckets, hiding the evidence before the next fight began. This wasn't out of respect. It was maintenance. The arena had to look pristine, as if death never happened. But you saw it. You felt it. The man you just fought might have trained beside you in the same ludus, might have eaten the same bread, shared stories about home, cried the same tears when no one was watching. Now he was just meat in the sand, and you were being led away to a cell or to another match, or rarely to cheers. If the crowd loved you, they roared. They called your name, whatever mock name the ludus had given you, and threw flowers, coins, even garments into the arena. Some stood on benches, pumping fists. Others held up fingers to count your victories. You were a hero in that moment, but not a free one. Victory didn't grant freedom. It granted survival. After the match, you were escorted back into the darkness beneath the amphitheater. Wounds were cleaned with vinegar or left to fester. A slave might apply a salve. If you could stand, you were congratulated by your trainer quickly, without warmth. The lanista didn't praise. He calculated. A good performance raised your value. Poor one dropped it. You were an asset, not a son. If you were badly injured, you were moved to a corner chamber, where the wounded waited. Some lay for days, dying slowly. No doctor came unless you were valuable. Most died silently, curled against the stone. The smell of rot clung to the walls. And yet some felt pride. Not for the killing, but for surviving. To live through one match in the Colosseum was more than most could claim. To survive 2, 3, 10, it turned you into something else. Not just a gladiator. A legend in the making. Men began to speak your name. Your victories were recorded on painted boards and announced by criers in the marketplace. Children mimicked your fighting style. Women carved your initials into tiles. Some nobles asked for your presence at feasts, not to dine, but to display. A few reached that rare status. Star. Like Flamma of Syria, who turned down freedom 4 times because the arena was his world. Or Spiculus, beloved by Nero himself, whose armor was displayed in temples. These men earned fame, but they were still tools. Their lives were managed. Their deaths inevitable. Even the most skilled weren't safe. An ankle twist, a lucky strike, a blade through the ribs. It only took a second. And the more famous you became, the more dangerous your opponents grew. The editor wanted blood. The crowd wanted to see if the champion could fall. You were never allowed to grow old in peace. The arena also had its politics. Emperors used it to curry favor. A generous editor who gave many games could rise in rank. A cruel one, who ordered executions often, might please the mob and intimidate rivals. You were a pawn in their ambitions. Sometimes a senator would ask to see a certain gladiator die, not out of hate, but because his rival favored him. It was all a game. You might fight in the morning and die by evening. Not in combat, but by order. And if you did win enough, if the gods, the crowd, and fate aligned, you might one day be granted the ludus. A wooden sword. Not a weapon, but a symbol. It meant you were free. Manumission. You were no longer owned. You could walk out of the ludus, your back unbranded, your arms no longer shackled. But most never did. Most died in the sand, cheered by strangers, mourned by none. Their names were forgotten. their faces blurred in the memories of 1,000 matches, their bones thrown in mass pits outside the city, alongside beggars and criminals. And the arena waited for the next match, the next show, the next man to be dressed in armor not of his choosing, handed a weapon not for his survival, but for Rome's entertainment. Because in the Colosseum, death wasn't an accident. It was the purpose. Some thought death in the arena was the end. But in truth, for many, death was just the beginning of Rome's next display. There were those who never trained in the ludus, never held a gladius, never learned to fight. They weren't gladiators. They were condemned. Sentenced by the courts under damnatio ad bestias, they were criminals, rebels, deserters, slaves who struck their masters, or Christians who refused to worship the emperor. The Colosseum consumed them by the hundreds, sometimes thousands, in a single day. They were tools of spectacle, stripped of dignity, not even granted the illusions that fighters had. No armor, no hope, just flesh for the beasts. The morning sessions were reserved for them. They were forced into the arena dressed as mythological figures. One might be made to play Actaeon, the hunter turned into a stag, torn apart by his own hounds. Real dogs, starved for days, released in a frenzy. Another might be cast as Orpheus, serenading wild animals, only for a hidden trapdoor to release a bear behind him. A woman might be made to play Dirce, tied to a bull by her hair, dragged until her skull split on the stones. These were executions turned into parables. The crowd laughed. They roared. They placed bets on how long the victim would last. Beasts weren't natural killers. They had to be trained, or more accurately, starved and enraged. Lions were kept underground in total darkness, denied food, whipped until madness boiled in their blood. When the trapdoor opened and the blinding sun hit their eyes, they charged at the first thing they saw. Elephants were sometimes used too, taught to trample by goads and burning torches. Crocodiles, panthers, even hippopotami, dragged from Africa or Asia, all part of the empire's harvest of terror. The audience didn't look away. They drank, they ate olives, they laughed. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders and cheered when heads rolled. For them, this wasn't cruelty. It was culture. Rome had always taught its people that pain meant power, that blood was a symbol of order, that watching men die kept the gods satisfied, and the mob entertained. And when the sand became too slick with gore, when the stench of meat grew too thick even for the open air, slaves would flood the arena with water. Buckets, pumps, channels built beneath the seats. Sometimes they even staged mock naval battles, naumachii, by flooding the floor and bringing in flat-bottomed boats. Prisoners were chained to the oars, forced to row until the signal came, and the battle began. They didn't use blunted weapons. Rome wanted drowning, bleeding, burning. It wanted death with variety. Everything was a stage. The crowd was not ashamed. They believed they were the pinnacle of civilization. To them, this was justice. This was discipline. And it was divine. But not every death was silent. Some resisted. Some spat at the emperor before their skulls were cracked open. Some Christians sang hymns as the lions tore at their legs. One man, a Thracian rebel, escaped his bindings and charged a guard, biting his throat out before being clubbed to death. The crowd howled with approval. They wanted resistance as much as they wanted submission. Both excited them. If a condemned man died too quickly, there were mutterings. Poor show. If he died well, screaming, flailing, crawling through blood, it was a success. His death was talked about for days, repeated in taverns and homes, told to children as bedtime stories of imperial greatness. The Colosseum wasn't just a place of violence. It was a ritual. Each day's events were a sacrifice, not to mercy or morality, but to control. Rome didn't just kill enemies, killed them with flair. It displayed their suffering like a tapestry. Every death reaffirmed the same truth. The empire ruled by fear, and it ruled absolutely. Gladiators knew this. That's why, despite their status, they often looked at the condemned with a kind of pity. They knew their fates weren't far apart. A few bad matches, one misstep, and a celebrated fighter could become nothing more than the next morning's opener. Even the animals suffered. They were shipped in cramped cages across seas, whipped, chained, mutilated. Many died before ever reaching Rome. Those that survived were forced to kill or die again and again. There was no glory in it, just hunger and pain. The crowd didn't care. They wanted movement, blood, roars. The natural world wasn't sacred. It was another victim. And through it all, the Colosseum stood immense, unmoved, echoing with the memory of tens of thousands of screams. Its underground chambers grew stained with the passage of years, the bones of the forgotten piling up in hidden corners, crushed under the boots of the living. Death in the arena wasn't a punishment. It was a schedule, something to be planned, announced, and applauded. Because in Rome, death didn't happen. Performed. Even if you survived the match, survived the lions, survived the politics of the editor and the whims of the crowd, what waited for you was not freedom, but more blood. Victory earned you another match. That was the cycle. The better you performed, the more valuable you became. But value in Rome didn't mean safety. It meant more demand, more fights, more danger. You were a prize animal now, and the crowds wanted you again and again. After each battle, your wounds marked your worth. Scars weren't shameful, they were trophies. The arena respected pain endured publicly. If you limped, if your arm trembled when raised, the mob noticed. Some admired the resilience. Others bet on your failure. Either way, the editor made sure you were scheduled for the next available spectacle. Those who survived more than a handful of matches became known. Their names circulated through the streets, on betting slates and in whispers at the baths. Some lanisti, owning schools with multiple successful fighters, paraded them like champions. They were brought to elite banquets, where senators gawked at their physiques, poked their calloused knuckles, and asked them to retell kills like ghost stories. You were still a slave. You sat at the foot of the table while Roman children touched your scars. They fed you wine and olives to see how fast you could eat. Then they sent you back to the ludus under escort, laughing as if your life was a party trick. Occasionally, women sent gifts. Some gladiators attracted admirers. Rich widows or wives of senators visited the training schools, claiming to be curious about Roman history, but they watched the men spar with undisguised hunger. A few arranged secret visits. Some paid for private performances. You weren't a man to them. You were a body, a fantasy. The dirtier your past, the more attractive you seemed. A few gladiators fathered children this way. They never saw them. They weren't permitted to claim family. The child of a gladiator was marked by shame, no matter who the mother was. Blood in the sand could never be washed clean. Some tried to build brotherhood in the ludus. Veterans helped new fighters survive their first matches. Some formed silent bonds, trained together, protected each other during group fights. But the system was designed to crush that. Eventually, they'd be paired against each other. The editor ensured it. Trust meant weakness. Rome knew that too well. If you survived long enough, you became eligible for freedom, but only at the discretion of the editor, the crowd, or the emperor. The rudis, a small wooden sword, symbolized your release. But it was rare. Most never saw it. Some were granted it after 20 victories, others never, even after 30. Flamma, the famed Syrian gladiator, was awarded the rudis 4 times. He rejected it 4 times. Why? Some say it was because he had nowhere to go. After years of fighting, his only identity was in the arena. The blood, the crowd, the rush. It was the only world that made sense. Outside, he was nothing. A scarred ex-slave with no trade, no protection, and enemies who remembered every man he killed. Even those who accepted freedom carried the weight. Bodies twisted by injury, limbs shattered and reset without proper care. Some lost vision in one eye, some never walked without a limp. More than a few lost fingers, ears, noses. One lived with a collapsed lung. They might wear a cloak now instead of armor, but they were still known by what they had done. And the mind didn't heal. Nightmares woke many of them. Some heard the roar of the crowd in their sleep. Others couldn't eat without tasting blood. Some avoided the amphitheater, turning their faces away when they passed its gates. Others stood outside, staring in, lips moving in silence. A few went back, Not to fight, but to sit in the stands and remember. No one knew why. There were no pensions, no land, no guaranteed future. Freedom was survival with uncertainty. A few open taverns. Some taught at smaller ludi, training the next generation of fighters. But those were exceptions. Most wandered. Most disappeared. And even if you reached that rare point of release, the shadow of your past followed you. You weren't a man. You were a gladiator. You were a killer. And in Rome, people never forgot what you were forced to become. Because once you had bled in the sand for their amusement, you were always theirs. Even free, you still belonged to the blood. Rome never forgot a gladiator, but not for the reasons you might hope. You were remembered not as a hero, not as a survivor, but as a part of the empire's machinery. An ornament of violence. A symbol of Rome's might. The people didn't care who you were beneath the scars. They remembered the noise you made when you struck the killing blow, the posture you held as blood soaked into your tunic, the way you died or didn't. The arena didn't just mold individuals. It shaped the culture. By the time the Colosseum was 3 generations old, it had become more than a place of games. It was the heart of Rome's identity. The games were scheduled like religious festivals. They followed imperial triumphs. They marked the birthdays of emperors. They served as gifts to the people in times of famine, war, or unrest. Bread might run short. Justice might falter. But there would always be games. To be a Roman citizen was to be a spectator of death. Children grew up watching executions. Parents brought their families to see lions tear men apart. A young boy might cheer louder than his father when a retiarius pierced a secutor through the eye. Old women whispered memories of famous duels as if recalling lost lovers. The arena taught them what power looked like. It looked like control, like command over life and death, like gods walking among mortals. Even slaves and the poor, those who lived only a rung above the condemned, found satisfaction in the violence. For one day they could look down on someone else. Someone bleeding in the dust. Someone less fortunate. Someone dying for their applause. And at the center of it all stood the Colosseum, massive, unshakable, sacred in its own right. Its construction had been paid for with spoils from the Jewish war, built on the labor of slaves from Jerusalem. It seated more than any theater in the empire. Every tier reflected the hierarchy of Rome. Senators and equestrians in the lowest rings, the plebs higher up, women and the poor at the top. Even in death, order was preserved. The emperors used it as a stage of dominance. They presided from their private box, clad in purple, surrounded by guards and flatterers. They decided who lived and who died with a flick of the hand. They smiled as men killed each other below them. It wasn't cruelty. It was control. The games reminded everyone, from slaves to senators, that Rome held the monopoly on force. But the Colosseum didn't just display Rome's strength. It consumed the identities of everyone who stepped into it. You weren't a Thracian farmer anymore. Not a Greek mercenary. Not a Carthaginian rebel. You were what they made you. Your past was erased. Your language silenced. Your gods forgotten. You became a gladiator, and that meant you existed only when the crowd was watching. The rest of your life was waiting for the next match. Even the best among you, those who earned their ludus, those granted freedom, found that freedom tasted hollow. Rome didn't want you unless you were fighting. You weren't feared or honored. You were no longer useful. Some begged to return. Some drank until they forgot. Some ended their own lives quietly, in alleyways or abandoned temples. A few tried to write down their stories. They dictated to scribes, carving out their version of events before the memory faded. But these texts rarely survived. Rome didn't care for the voices of the used. It preserved the names of emperors, of senators, of architects, not of slaves. Others vanished into the countryside, joining bandits or starting new lives under assumed names. But their bodies betrayed them. Walk into any village, and a man with a bent spine, shattered hand or half-missing foot would be asked, "Were you one of them?" The answer was always in the silence. Because even if you lived past the arena, your identity was shaped by it. The rhythms of combat, the taste of iron in your mouth, the roar of strangers deciding if you were worthy to keep breathing. these didn't fade. They became the drumbeat of your days. And Rome didn't forget you because it respected you. It remembered you because it owned you. You weren't just a fighter. You were the story Rome told itself about control, about order, about strength through spectacle. Even in peace, the shadow of the arena stretched over every field, every market, every bath. Because the Colosseum didn't just entertain the empire. It defined it, and through that definition, it took everything from you. Your name, your past, your freedom, your future, until all that remained was the echo of a sword striking bone, and the roar of a crowd that never truly saw you.